My name is Alex Coleman. 6 months ago, that name meant something in the world of structural architecture. It was a name associated with sleek, ambitious designs that defied gravity, with buildings that scraped the clouds and won awards. I was a man who dealt in absolutes, stress tolerances, load-bearing capacities, the unwavering laws of physics. My world was one of blueprints and steel, a reality built on precision and logic. Then came the Cascade Point Tower, my magnum opus. And then came the collapse. Not of the building. It still stands, a monument to my curtailed ambition, but of a single, critical cantilevered observation deck. An inquiry, lawsuits, and a media firestorm followed. The fault was traced to a minute, almost imperceptible miscalculation in my design. A ghost in my machine. In the end, I lost my firm, my reputation, and in the quiet, protracted fallout, my marriage. So, I ran. I ran from the city, from the accusing headlines that still flashed behind my eyes, and from the phantom feeling of falling that jolted me awake at night. I sought the opposite of my former life, not complexity, but simplicity. Not the sky, but the earth. I found it in a classified ad, a single cryptic line, farmhand needed for remote cattle operation. Eastern Colorado, room and board included. No experience necessary. The drive east from Denver was a process of erasure. The mountains receded in my rearview mirror, their jagged certainty giving way to the vast, oceanic flatness of the high plains. The landscape was a relentless, monotonous expanse of pale grass and immense sky that seemed to press down on the world. For hours, the only signs of life were the occasional pronghorn antelope and the skeletal remains of long, abandoned homesteads, their wooden frames collapsing back into the soil from which they'd been raised with such futile hope a century ago. This was a land that had broken people, a place where dreams came to dry up and blow away. It felt appropriate. The directions led me down a series of progressively smaller roads until the asphalt gave way to gravel, and finally to a simple dirt track marked by a faded wooden sign that read, Henderson. The farm itself appeared suddenly, a small cluster of buildings huddled together as if for protection against the sheer emptiness. There was a modest, 2-story farmhouse built of weathered timber and local sandstone, a large, red barn with a rusting tin roof, a few sheds, and a stark, metal silo that stood like a watchtower over the property. A man and a woman emerged from a smaller cottage, set 100 yards from the main house. They were the Hendersons, a couple who looked as though they'd been carved from the land itself. He was tall and gaunt, with a face cross-hatched by wrinkles and eyes the color of the washed-out sky. She was shorter, her body thick and solid, her expression unreadable. They moved with a slow, deliberate economy, wasting no gestures and no words. "You're Coleman?" Mr. Henderson stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Alex." He nodded, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, a quick, dispassionate appraisal. "The main house is yours," he said, gesturing with his chin. "We keep to the cottage. Your work is sunrise to sunset. The chores are on the board in the barn." Questions? "No, sir. I'm ready to work." "Good." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, holding out a single sheet of folded, yellowed paper. Her hand was rough, her knuckles swollen. "The rules," she said, her voice a low rasp. "You'll want to learn them." I took the paper. It was heavy, fibrous, and typed on what must have been an ancient machine. I unfolded it and read, 1. Your workday is sunrise to sunset. Do not work before or after. The land needs its rest. 2. The main house is your own. We will not enter without invitation. Do not enter our cottage after dark for any reason. 3. Keep all gates closed and latched at all times. especially the north pasture gate after sundown. 4. The well water is for the livestock only. Your water comes from the cistern. Keep the cistern lid weighted down with the sandstone block. 5. Ignore the woman who sometimes sings from the empty silo. She is not singing for you. Do not look up at the top of the silo at night. 6. If you find a child's toy in the fields, a wooden horse, a cloth doll, leave it where it lies. Do not touch it. Do not bring it inside. 7. You may hear knocking from inside the root cellar. There is nothing in the root cellar. 8. Do not attempt to count the cattle after midnight. The number is never correct. If they seem distressed, turn on the floodlight at the back of the barn for 1 hour, then turn it off and go back inside. 9. A man in a dusty hat may sometimes be seen walking the property line at dusk. He is checking the fences. He is not real. Do not speak to him. 10. If you smell rain on a clear day, go inside immediately and lock the doors. Wait until the smell passes. 11. The land remembers. Do not make it any promises you cannot keep. I read the list twice, a frown creasing my brow. My rational mind, the architect's mind, immediately began to deconstruct it, searching for logical explanations. The work hours were a safety precaution on a remote property. The gate rule was standard livestock management. The water rule was likely about an old, contaminated well versus a clean cistern. The others were harder to dismiss. They felt like the superstitions of deeply isolated people, the folk tales of the backwoods, born from loneliness and the vast, disquieting silence of the plains. But the Hendersons' dead, serious demeanor suggested something far more profound than simple eccentricity. They left me then, retreating to their cottage as the sun began to dip below the horizon, leaving me alone with the house, the land, and the list of unnerving commandments. The first few days were a blur of hard, satisfying labor. I mended fences until my hands were raw, cleaned the cavernous barn, and hauled feed until my muscles screamed in protest. The physical exhaustion was a balm, silencing the recriminations that had echoed in my head for months. I tried to put the list out of my mind, to treat it as a quirky employee handbook for a job on the fringes of civilization. But the land wouldn't let me. The suspense began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow burn of escalating unease that made me question my own senses. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the silo, I heard a faint, mournful singing. It was a woman's voice, wordless and achingly sad, seeming to ride on the wind itself. I stopped, my shovel halfway to the ground. I told myself it was just the wind whistling through a gap in the corrugated metal, a sonic illusion created by the endless plains. But I remembered Rule 50, ignore the woman who sometimes sings from the empty silo. She is not singing for you. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, turned my back on the silo, and walked away, the beautiful, sorrowful melody fading behind me. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound from below. Thump, thump, thump. It was a rhythmic, insistent knocking, seemingly coming from the very floorboards beneath my bed. The main house was built over a shallow root cellar, its slanted doors bolted shut from the outside. The sound could have been the old house settling, or a branch knocking against the foundation in the wind. But it was too steady, too deliberate. I thought of Rule 7. You may hear knocking from inside the root cellar. There is nothing in the root cellar. I pulled the pillow over my head, but the sound seemed to seep through the down and into my skull, a hollow, patient beat in the profound silence of the plains. The most unsettling event, the one that truly began to fray the edges of my carefully constructed reality, happened on the third day, The sky was a flawless, searing blue. The air was bone, dry, the sun relentless. There wasn't a hint of a cloud from horizon to horizon. And then I smelled it. The rich, loamy scent of petrichor. The smell of rain hitting dry, thirsty soil. It was unmistakable and utterly impossible. My heart hammered against my ribs as I remembered Rule 10 If you smell rain on a clear day, go inside immediately and lock the doors. A wave of panic, primal and illogical, washed over me. I dropped my post, hole digger, and ran for the house, my breath catching in my throat. I slammed the door behind me, turned the deadbolt, and stood with my back pressed against the wood, my mind racing. What was I doing, hiding from a smell? My pragmatic nature fought back. It was a phantom smell, an olfactory hallucination brought on by stress, dehydration, and the sheer weirdness of this place. I was a man of logic, of cause and effect. Yet, I stayed inside, peering out the window at the serene, sun-drenched landscape until the smell finally, inexplicably faded. This was the beginning of the true horror, not a sudden shock, but a quiet, creeping dread. The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture, making me an accomplice in my own unraveling. I, the rational man, was beginning to follow the irrational rules. The reader, of course, would know the danger was real, creating a palpable dramatic irony. I was the fool walking through the minefield, trying to convince myself the mines weren't real, even as my foot hovered over the trigger. The foundation of my world, once built on the bedrock of science and reason, was beginning to crack. The phantom smell of rain and the memory of the knocking from the root cellar clung to me for days. A low, grade fever in the back of my mind. I threw myself into the work with a desperate fervor, hoping to sweat out the unease. The physical world, at least, still made sense. A fence post was either solid or rotten. A wire was taut or slack. I spent my days under the oppressive, empty sky. My only companions the indifferent cattle and the ceaseless wind that whispered through the dry grass. The isolation, which I had once craved as a sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a pressure chamber. My own thoughts, once my most trusted tools, were becoming unreliable. The silence of the plains was so absolute that it forced me to listen to the frantic, circular logic of my own mind as I tried, and failed, to explain away what I had experienced. I was a man who built things on foundations of solid rock. Now, I felt as though I was living on a fault line, the ground beneath my feet threatening to give way at any moment. My past failure, the collapse of the observation deck, had been a matter of physics, a miscalculation I could understand, even if I couldn't forgive myself for it. This was different. This was a failure of reality itself. One sweltering afternoon, I was checking the fence line in the north pasture, the farthest edge of the property. The sun beat down, bleaching the color from the landscape. It was out there, half hidden in a clump of sagebrush, that I saw a small, wooden horse. It was crudely carved but lovingly detailed, its paint faded to pastel ghosts of its original colors. One of its legs was broken. My first instinct, a simple human impulse, was to pick it up. Some child must have lost it. Though I hadn't seen another soul for miles, the thought of a child's sadness was a tangible thing in the vast loneliness. I reached for it, my fingers hovering just above the weathered wood. Then Rule 6 echoed in my head, cold and absolute. If you find a child's toy in the fields, a wooden horse, a cloth doll, leave it where it lies. Do not touch it. Do not bring it inside. I recoiled as if the toy were red hot. I stared at it, my mind a battlefield. It was just a toy, a piece of wood. To leave it here felt cruel, illogical. But the memory of the phantom rain, The impossible scent that had sent me running for cover held me back. Was this another test? Another piece of the farm's incomprehensible puzzle? I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was nothing. Only the grass, the sky, and the silent, waiting toy. With a curse of frustration, I turned and walked away, leaving the little horse to its lonely vigil in the sagebrush. But I couldn't leave the image of it behind. It rode in my mind for the rest of the day, a symbol of a choice I didn't understand. The true assault on my sanity came a few evenings later. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. I was cleaning tools in the barn, the familiar smells of hay and manure a small comfort. I glanced out the wide barn door and froze. There, walking along the distant property line, was a figure, a man, silhouetted against the dying light, wearing what looked like a wide, brimmed hat. He walked with a slow, steady gait, pausing every so often as if inspecting the fence. My heart leaped with a desperate hope. Another person, someone to talk to, someone to prove I wasn't alone out here, losing my mind. I took a step forward, ready to shout, to wave, to break the spell of my solitude. But Rule 9 seized me with an ice-cold grip. A man in a dusty hat may sometimes be seen walking the property line at dusk. He is checking the fences. He is not real. Do not speak to him. Not real. The words were a physical blow. I ducked back into the shadows of the barn, my breath catching in my throat. I peered out again. He was still there, a dark shape, moving with unnerving purpose at the edge of my world. He looked real. He moved like a real person. My mind screamed at me to reject the rule, to trust my own eyes. But a deeper, more primal fear, born of the last few days, held me fast. What if the rule was right? What would happen if I called out to something that wasn't supposed to be there? I stayed hidden, my knuckles white, as I gripped a rusty wrench and watched until the man in the dusty hat simply faded into the deepening twilight, swallowed by the immense darkness of the plains. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house was his footstep on the porch. Every whisper of the wind was his voice at the window. My breaking point arrived a few nights after that, delivered by the cattle. I was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep by a sound of pure terror. It wasn't the lowing of contented animals. It was a chorus of deep, guttural moans, a sound of collective, mortal fear. I threw on my boots and ran to the barn, my heart pounding. The moon was high and bright, casting the pasture in a ghostly, silver light. The entire herd was bunched together against the far fence, a single, trembling mass of bodies. Their eyes were wide, white, rimmed with panic, and they were all staring out into the darkness of the open plains at something I couldn't see. I remembered the first part of Rule 80C, do not attempt to count the cattle after midnight. The number is never correct. It was a direct challenge to my architect's brain, to the part of me that believed in order, in numbers, in a world that could be measured and understood. In an act of pure defiance, I started counting. My eyes scanned the panicked herd. 48. I blinked, recounted. 50. My brow furrowed. I did it again, slower this time, pointing at each animal. 47. A wave of vertigo washed over me. It was impossible. They were just cows. They couldn't simply appear and disappear. My logic, my last bastion against the encroaching madness, crumbled into dust. Panic seized me. I fumbled in my pocket for the list, my hands shaking as I read the rest of the rule. If they seem distressed, turn on the floodlight at the back of the barn for 1 hour, then turn it off and go back inside. I scrambled to the switch box on the barn wall. With a loud clank, a powerful floodlight mounted on the roof blazed to life, bathing the pasture in a harsh, sterile glare. The cattle flinched, then slowly, the terrible moaning began to subside. They were still afraid, but the light seemed to hold back whatever was lurking in the dark. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my watch clutched in my hand. 1 hour. Not a minute more, not a minute less. The precision of it was both insane and the only thing I had to cling to. When 60 minutes had passed, I took a deep breath, slapped the switch off, and plunged the world back into moonlight. I didn't look back. I ran to the house, slammed the door, and bolted it, my mind a screaming void. I couldn't take it anymore. The slow burn of suspense had become a raging fire. I was a character in a story whose rules I didn't know, facing a threat I couldn't see or comprehend. I needed answers. I needed the Hendersons. To hell with their rules. As the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, I left the farmhouse and marched toward their cottage. A single, yellow light glowed in their window, a tiny beacon of supposed sanity in the vast, encroaching darkness. As I drew closer, I slowed my steps. I could hear voices from within. Not the gruff, clipped tones of the Hendersons, but something else. A low, rhythmic chanting. It wasn't a language I recognized. It was guttural, ancient, full of clicks and deep, throated sounds that seemed to vibrate in the air. My fear warred with my desperation. I crept to the side of the cottage, staying low, and peered through the edge of the window frame. The room was lit by an oil lamp. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson were there, but they weren't alone. They were kneeling on the floor, and in front of them, sitting in a high, backed wooden chair as if holding court, was the man in the dusty hat. He wasn't a silhouette anymore. I could see his face, shadowed and indistinct, but undeniably solid. He wasn't speaking. He was just listening as the Hendersons chanted, and on the small table beside his chair, placed as if it were a sacred offering, sat a small, broken, wooden horse. The scene in the cottage window shattered the last remnants of my rational world. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a ghost. The man in the dusty hat was solid, real, and sitting in that chair like a king on a throne. The Hendersons, my stoic, severe employers, were on their knees before him. They're chanting a desperate, placating murmur, and the toy, the broken wooden horse I had deliberately left in the field, was there on the table, an offering laid before a dark god. Every rule on that yellowed sheet of paper clicked into place, not as the superstitions of isolated farmers, but as the articles of a terrifying treaty. They weren't protecting me. They were managing me. The knocking, the singing, the phantom rain, they were all signs of its presence, its influence bleeding through the seams of reality. And I, by breaking Rule 2 and coming to the cottage after dark, had just crashed their ceremony. A cold, paralyzing dread rooted me to the spot. My mind, the architect's mind that craved order and reason, was screaming. This was a place where the laws of physics were subordinate to older, more terrible laws. The land itself was party to a pact, and the Hendersons were its terrified priests. The man in the hat wasn't a ghost. He was an entity, ancient and patient, and I had just drawn its undivided attention. I had to run. Not just back to the farmhouse, but away from this entire cursed stretch of the plains. I tried to back away slowly, silently, but my boot came down on a dry, brittle twig. It snapped with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the immense quiet. The chanting inside the cottage stopped instantly. A profound silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then, the single oil lamp in the window was extinguished. My heart seized. I turned and ran. Panic is a primal engine. It strips away thought, leaving only the screaming need for survival. I sprinted across the hard, packed dirt, my lungs burning, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the pursuit, not as the sound of footsteps, but as a chilling pressure on the air behind me, a wave of cold that seemed to gain on me with unnatural speed. The farmhouse, my supposed sanctuary, was too far. My only hope was my car, parked near the main road. My flight became a desperate, chaotic tour of the farm's horrors. As I neared the silo, the woman's song began, no longer faint and mournful, but a piercing, triumphant wail that seemed to mock my terror. I veered away, my eyes fixed on the ground, remembering the second half of Rule 50. Do not look up at the top of the silo at night. I ran past the main house, and as I did, the knocking from the root cellar began again. Thump, 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 a frantic, angry heartbeat rising from the earth itself, as if the land was furious at my attempt to escape. I cut across the open fields, the tall, dry grass whipping at my legs. Ahead of me loomed the north pasture gate. Rule 3 flashed in my mind: keep all gates closed and latched at all times, especially the north pasture gate after sundown. The gate was my most direct path to the road. To go around would cost precious seconds. My rational mind, what was left of it, told me it was just a gate. But my new terror, sharpened instincts, screamed that the rule existed for a reason. I could feel the presence behind me getting closer, a palpable void in the night. I had no choice. I fumbled with the heavy iron latch, my fingers clumsy with fear. The metal was unnaturally cold. As the gate swung open with a low groan, the air grew still. The chirping of the crickets ceased. The wind died. A deep, predatory silence fell over the north pasture. I hesitated for only a second before plunging through, slamming the gate shut behind me. I didn't know what I had just let in or out, but I knew I had broken another, more important rule. I found a moment's respite behind a thicket of overgrown cottonwoods, my body screaming for oxygen, my mind racing to assemble the horrifying puzzle. The Hendersons weren't the villains here. They were prisoners, just like me. They were tending this farm not for cattle, but for the entity. They were maintaining the fragile peace treaty outlined in the rules. This land was a sacred place that had been profaned, desecrated by the failed homesteaders who had tried to tame it a century ago. Those settlers hadn't just been broken by drought and hardship. They had trespassed, and the land's guardian had punished them for it. The entity, this man in the dusty hat, was perhaps a spirit from the folklore of the tribes who came before, the Cheyenne or Arapaho, a trickster like Wihio, whose nature had been twisted by the desecration of his domain. He was checking the fences, not to keep cattle in, but to keep his territory defined. And I wasn't a farmhand. My predecessor hadn't just quit. I was the new variable in their equation. My job was to live by the rules, to reinforce the pact through obedience. Perhaps I was meant to be an offering, a sacrifice to renew the treaty. Or worse, perhaps I was being groomed as a replacement. My failure to follow the rules, my defiance, hadn't just endangered me, it had broken the pact. A new surge of adrenaline propelled me from my hiding place. I could see my car now, a dark shape reflecting the cold starlight, a symbol of civilization and escape. I burst from the trees and ran the final 100 yards, keys clutched in my sweaty palm. The cold pressure at my back intensified, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. The Hendersons were there, standing at the edge of the pasture, two grim statues. But closer, moving across the field with an impossible, gliding speed, was the man in the hat. He wasn't running. He was simply advancing, the distance between us shrinking with each of my frantic heartbeats. I reached the car, jammed the key into the lock, and threw myself inside, slamming and locking the door. For a single, glorious second, I felt safe, encased in steel and glass. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. Click. Nothing. I tried again. Click, click, click. The battery was dead. The engine was silent. A wave of utter despair washed over me. I was trapped. I slumped against the steering wheel, my breath fogging the windshield. And then, a soft tapping sound on the driver's side window. Tap. Tap. I slowly lifted my head. The man in the dusty hat was standing there. I could see him clearly in the moonlight. His face was a shifting collection of shadows, his features indistinct and impossible to focus on, but his eyes were 2 points of ancient, chilling intelligence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He simply looked at me with an expression of calm, absolute ownership. In that moment, I understood the final, terrible truth. The rules were not a test I could pass or fail. They were an introduction, an acclamation. The job was never about mending fences or hauling feed. The job was about the land. The land remembers, Rule 11 had said, and it needed a new memory, a new guardian, a new man to walk the property line at dusk. The chase wasn't about killing me. It was about running me to the end of my own world and into his. He raised a hand, not to strike the glass, but to press his palm against it. The glass didn't break. It shimmered, and a wave of cold seeped through. Not the cold of a winter night, but a deep, cellular cold, the cold of the earth, of the grave. My panic dissolved, replaced by a strange, hollow resignation. My past life, the buildings, the awards, the failure, the shame, it all seemed like a story that had happened to someone else a long, long time ago. All that mattered now was the land, the fences, the gates, and the endless, patient sky. I looked at my own hands on the steering wheel, and for a moment, they didn't seem like my own. They seemed weathered, ancient, as if they had been checking these fences for 100 years. The man outside the window smiled, a crack in the shadows. He wasn't real, but soon I would be. The cold seeping through the glass was not a physical sensation. It was an erasure. It flowed into me, a silent, numbing tide, and washed away the man named Alex Coleman. The memories of steel and glass towers, of blueprints and awards, of a failed marriage and a catastrophic miscalculation. They didn't vanish, but they lost their meaning, becoming flat, two-dimensional images from a story about someone else. The panic, the terror, the desperate, scrabbling need to survive, all of it dissolved into a profound and unnerving calm. The man in the dusty hat, his face a vortex of shifting shadows, did not need to break the glass. He was simply unlocking the door to my own mind. I was no longer a man who had run from his life. I was a man who had run to his destiny. The horror wasn't in the monster outside the car. The horror was the realization that the house I was meant to occupy had been waiting for me all along, and it was not made of timber and stone. It was made of this land, this sky, this silence. My frantic chase across the fields hadn't been an escape attempt. It was an initiation ritual. Every broken rule was a step closer to this moment, a shedding of the skin of my old reality. With a sense of dreamlike inevitability, I unlocked the car door and stepped out. The night air was still and cold. The man in the hat was gone. Or perhaps he was no longer separate from me. I looked down at my hands, the hands of an architect, hands that had once drafted the future. They seemed alien, ancient. I flexed them, feeling a power I didn't recognize. I was no longer the protagonist of my own story. I had been absorbed into a much older one, a narrative written into the very soil beneath my feet. I turned my gaze from the useless car and looked out over the property. It was different now. I didn't see fields of grass and a collection of buildings. I saw a territory, a domain with borders that were both physical and metaphysical. I saw the lines of power that crisscrossed the landscape, the areas of influence, the points of weakness. The rules on that yellowed paper were not arbitrary warnings. They were the laws of this place, the operating manual for a machine of immense and terrible power. And I was now its custodian. My feet began to move, not towards the house or the road, but along the property line. I was checking the fences. It was my purpose. The thought arose in my mind with the simple clarity of a law of physics. The land remembers, Rule 11 had stated. It remembered the homesteaders who had come a century ago, arrogant and ignorant, scarring the plains with their plows, believing they could tame a power they didn't even know existed. They had profaned this place, and the land had responded. The entity I had seen, the one I was now becoming, was not an evil spirit in the human sense. It was the land's immune system, a guardian spirit twisted into a figure of dread by the desecration it was forced to endure. As I walked, the farm's mysteries unfolded before me, not as questions, but as simple facts. I glanced at the silo, and I understood the woman's song. She was a memory, an echo of a past tragedy, perhaps one of the first settlers who had broken a promise to the land. Her song wasn't for anyone. It was a permanent feature of the landscape, like a scar, a constant reminder of the consequences of disrespect. I felt the presence in the root cellar, a low, thrumming energy. It was not something to be feared, but something to be contained, a pocket of raw power that the rules kept dormant. The knocking was its protest, its desire to be free. I looked toward the pasture where the cattle huddled, their numbers shifting in the moonlight like a quantum state. They were not just livestock. They were a living part of the pact, their life force a constant, low-level sacrifice that fed the land and kept the greater balance. To count them was to try and apply human logic to a supernatural equation, an act of supreme arrogance that the land would not permit. From the crest of a low hill, I could see the Hendersons' cottage, a single light burning again in the window. I no longer felt anger or fear toward them. I understood their role. They were the tenders, the priests of this strange, blighted church. They maintained the human side of the bargain, performing the rituals, leaving the offerings, the broken toys, symbols of lost innocence, to placate the guardian. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also keepers of the flame. Their lives were a constant, terrified act of worship. They were not my employers, they were my servants. My transformation was nearly complete. The last vestiges of Alex Coleman, the man of logic and reason, were fading like the morning mist. He was a flawed, broken man who had sought refuge in isolation, only to find that true isolation was not the absence of people, but the absence of self. I was becoming something else, something necessary, something eternal. The horror was not that I was going to die. The horror was that I was going to live forever. Days turned into nights, seasons into years. Time lost its linear meaning, becoming a cycle of sunrise and sunset, of planting and harvest, of silence and song. I walked the fences. I watched the sky. I felt the pulse of the land. The Hendersons grew older, their movements slower, their faces etched with a deeper terror. They continued their rituals, their lives a testament to the pact we all served. Then one day, a new car, dusty and unfamiliar, rattled down the dirt track. A young man got out, his face a mask of hope and desperation, a man running from a life that had failed him. I watched from the shadow of the barn as the Hendersons approached him. I saw Mrs. Henderson, her hand trembling slightly, hold out a single sheet of folded, yellowed paper. The young man took it. He unfolded it, and he began to read. I watched him, feeling no pity, no kinship. He was merely a new component, a fresh variable in the ancient, unyielding equation. He would learn the rules, or he would break them. He would obey, or he would defy. He would live in fear, or he would run. It did not matter. The path was laid. The land remembers. And I, the man who was no longer a man, stood my watch, my dusty hat pulled low, waiting for the sun to set.